Somewhere in America, in the deep quiet of a 1940s night, the world was changing in ways most people could not yet see. City streets hummed with ordinary life. Streetcars, corner diners, families returning home from evening shifts. But behind the walls of certain government buildings and university laboratories, something extraordinary and deeply consequential was taking shape. Scientists were unlocking the fundamental forces of matter itself. The Manhattan Project had accelerated nuclear science at a pace history had never witnessed before. Physicists, chemists, and medical researchers worked around the clock, surrounded by Geiger counters, glass containers filled with luminescent materials, classified notebooks, and equipment that most of the world would never see. The atomic bomb had ended a world war, but it had also opened a door that no one fully understood how to walk through safely. Radiation was powerful. Radiation was potentially lethal. And almost no one knew exactly what it did inside the human body. The urgency was real and scientifically legitimate. Researchers needed to understand how radioactive substances moved through human tissue, how the body absorbed them, how long they remained, and at what concentrations they became dangerous. These were not abstract questions. Soldiers, workers, and scientists were already being exposed to radiation in various settings. The government needed answers quickly, and so, within the broader framework of wartime and Cold War research, a series of medical studies began. Studies that would later raise some of the most serious ethical questions in the history of American medicine. Some of these studies involved introducing radioactive materials directly into human subjects. Among the most documented cases were experiments involving plutonium, a highly radioactive element produced as a byproduct of nuclear reactor operations. Between approximately 1945 and 1947, a small number of hospital patients were injected with plutonium as part of research efforts connected to the Manhattan Project. The goal was to measure how the human body processed and eliminated the substance. The patients involved were generally seriously ill, but the critical question that would haunt these experiments for decades was straightforward. Were these individuals fully informed about what was being done to them? Inside 1940s and 1950s hospitals, the distance between what patients understood and what researchers were studying was significant. Doctors in white coats moved through wards, nurses recorded observations on medical charts, and administrators filed reports into folders marked with classification designations that ordinary citizens would never encounter. The research was not conducted by reckless individuals. Many of the scientists involved were serious professionals operating within the institutional frameworks of their time. Informed consent, as it is understood today, the legal and ethical requirement that patients receive complete, comprehensible information before participating in research, did not exist in its modern form during this period. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 following the trials of Nazi doctors, had outlined principles for ethical human experimentation. But its application within American government-sponsored research was inconsistent at best. Classified documents were stored in locked filing cabinets. Research findings circulated within restricted government channels. And for decades, the broader public remained entirely unaware that these experiments had taken place. Time moved forward. Calendars turned from the late 1940s into the 1950s, then the 1960s, then the 1970s. The Cold War deepened. Nuclear testing continued. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union kept national security concerns at the center of government decision-making. Within that environment, secrecy was not merely bureaucratic habit, it was considered essential to national survival. Old government archives accumulated, filing cabinets filled with reports that no journalist had ever read and no congressional committee had ever reviewed. Historians working in adjacent fields occasionally encountered references to unusual medical studies, but the full picture remained obscured. The people who had participated in these experiments, or their families, had no way of knowing the complete nature of what had occurred. The information simply was not available to them. It existed in classified form, locked away in the administrative infrastructure of the early atomic state. The story did not stay buried forever. Beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating through the early 1990s, investigative journalists and researchers began piecing together fragments of the historical record. Declassified documents, obtained through persistent records requests and the gradual opening of government archives, began revealing the outlines of what had happened decades earlier. In 1993, journalist Eileen Wellsome published a series of reports that brought the plutonium injection experiments into public view with documented specificity, eventually earning a Pulitzer Prize. The response from the federal government was significant. President Bill Clinton ordered a comprehensive review. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments was established, bringing together historians, scientists, ethicists, and legal experts to examine the full scope of government-sponsored radiation research conducted on human subjects. Congressional hearing rooms filled with witnesses. Microphones captured testimony from researchers, government officials, and family members of individuals who had participated in studies they had never fully understood. Newspaper headlines carried the story to millions of Americans encountering it for the first time. What the investigations confirmed was not a simple story of villains and victims. It was something more complicated and, in many ways, more troubling. It was the story of institutions operating under extraordinary pressure, making decisions that reflected the ethical limitations of their era, and doing so in conditions of deliberate secrecy that prevented any external accountability. The fundamental questions raised by these experiments have not disappeared. How much information does a patient deserve before participating in medical research? Can national security ever justify experimentation conducted without meaningful consent? And when scientific capability advances faster than the ethical frameworks designed to govern it, who protects the people caught in between? In a quiet archival room, an old medical file rests on a table beside a Geiger counter and faded photographs. A researcher slowly closes the file. Outside, a modern city moves through the night, carrying its history forward without always knowing what that history contains. The atomic age gave humanity extraordinary power, but the history of human radiation experiments also forced the world to ask a darker question. When science moves faster than ethics, who protects the people caught in between? Dark Experiments, Episode 5.